A little while ago, I stumbled across a video on YouTube in a format that many will already recognise. It's essentially a collaboration of different channels asking somewhat loaded questions to a specific group, be it racial, religious or political. I saved that video with the intention to respond to it and to answer the questions, but alas I completely forgot about it. So whilst at the time of recording the video I am responding to is a few months old, the questions themselves aren't exactly something that have a strict time limit, and as a freedom-loving voluntarist, I feel that I am more than qualified to respond to what is being put forward. So without further delay, it's time to look at the video.
What makes you think that the non-aggression principle would play out in practice? It's something that every person in that society would have to be educated on and abide by. I know you don't advocate for no system of government and no laws, but the mere idea of a non-aggression principle, it just seems outlandish, at least as an expectation for how people should act.
Claiming just that it is outlandish is a logical fallacy, known as the argument from incredulity. However, the non-aggression principle isn't necessarily something that an anarcho-capitalist would argue should be the principle to follow. The argument is usually that it is a principle we all follow every day. Every conversation we have that doesn't result in violence, every transaction we make, not including VAT of course, and every job we do. It is also expected that people will indeed violate it, and that's specifically why it allows for self-defense, be it directly or through a third party. The argument is in fact that we should apply the principles we hold in daily life to the state, that is the greatest violator of them. And also, yes, I do advocate for no government and in turn no laws, or at least government and laws in the manner that they are currently understood and in the way that you are asking.
How would a country defend its borders in an ANCAP system? Do you even believe in the idea of a country?
A country is a geographical place? Yes, sure, just in the same way that a city is a geographical place. In a free society, however, all property would be privately owned, and have their own private borders that the individuals owning that land would be responsible for. If they want their private borders to be open, that would be up to them, and if they want to close them, that is also up to them.
Do you expect to maintain a nation-state without any kind of a government to defend the borders of said nation-state? Do you plan on everybody, just as soon as there's trouble, taking up arms? What about the people who don't want to fight? Would you force them to defend the homeland?
Now, most of this question is somewhat irrelevant. If there is a nation-state, there is not a free society. If there are public borders, there is not a free society. If someone attempts to violate your property, you can hire those that are willing to act in third-party self-defense to assist you. In the case of something larger scale, many people would likely do so, as it would be in their best interests, be it for financial reasons or in defense of their property as well.
You guys claim that everything that the state does end up in violence. Has there not been a point where the state does not do something that end up in violence?
The double negative in your question threw me for a bit. Now, the state is funded through the threat of violence, meaning that everything it does is linked to violence. But in terms of individual actions separate from the funding, I'm sure there are occasions, just not many that I can think of off the top of my head.
Why do you guys hate taxes so much?
For the same reason people hate perpetrators of armed violence.
How do you rationalize the idea that taxation is theft? I know you'll always default to the argument that, well, if you don't pay it, there are people coming to your door with guns to take you away or to take the money by force, but you're forgetting that you participate in a society. And I don't want to be the guy who says that this is some sort of necessary cost of living in a society because of the benefits that it provides. But have you ever thought about it that way?
Sure, perhaps it is a necessary cost of society. I don't think it is. But even if that were the case, it does not change the nature of it. It would only be a justification of it. It is theft because it is taking property without the consent of the person who has rightful ownership of it. It being a necessary cost, as you put it, doesn't suddenly make it a voluntary transaction.
If Somalia is not the best example of an anarchist society, then what is?
Somalia isn't that much of an example, considering that it has an operating government. Throughout the 90s, however, when central government was, for all intents and purposes, absent, the economy and quality in Somalia improved quite rapidly when you compare it to its neighbours. Despite this, however, regional warlords and the US that was funding them meant this was not a free society by any means, despite the economic benefits of an unregulated market. As to what a good example of one might be, I can't give you an answer there actually, as to my knowledge no society has ever been truly free as of yet.
How do you expect to keep your citizenry safe from rogue companies, essentially, who want to cut corners at the cost of the consumer and workers' safety?
Employees moving to one of their many competitors, customers that are unhappy, either boycotting or going elsewhere, perhaps even a security firm to protect you should they go rogue. The question is, why would they do so when every market incentive points towards keeping your customers happy, especially in a competitive market?
If a constitutional republic is not the best way to run a country, what is the best government to run a country?
The correct answer is no government.
How do you implement a working ANCAP society?
Everyone will answer this question differently, but my opinion would be gradual decentralization of power and selling off of government assets to multiple small companies to incentivize a competitive market. But that's just my opinion. If I knew the definitive answer to this question, it would be a good argument for a dictatorship, but I don't, and it isn't.
Would an ANCAP system allow me to sell a 9-year-old heroin-addicted child prostitute into slavery?
No, they have self-ownership. If you tried to, people would be outraged and used third-party self-defense to stop you, either themselves or through a security firm.
How does the free market do everything better than the government?
By incentivizing the improvement of quality, the lowering of costs, and maintaining a good public image, so that you can compete in that market, unlike the monopoly of the state that has none of those incentives. To turn that question around, how could the government ever do anything better than the free market?
How do you plan on maintaining things like hospitals, police stations, and roads without any source of regulation to keep them in order?
The same way we do everything else. Individuals, companies, and charities that operate to fulfill a demand that is there in the market. Or are you going to tell me that there is no demand for hospitals or roads suddenly?
Why do most of the ANCAPs that I've discussed things with default to the ethical arguments of everything? Nothing is black and white. I don't think everything can be decided on ethical grounds. And I think if it can, it's subjective enough that it can be argued either way.
I would agree that morality is entirely subjective. It's exactly why I believe in a free society. It would allow the most people to live the closest to their own personal morality, unlike the state, which allows one group to impose their own morality onto everybody else. A belief in objective morality is not a requirement of anarcho-capitalism. You've probably just been talking to Randian objectivists.
If you vote with your wallet, doesn't that mean you get more power if you have more money?
Theoretically, you would be able to temporarily raise the demand for a product by buying a lot of it, but there's no incentive for you to do so. Just because I have more money doesn't mean I'm going to suddenly buy more than one toothbrush, for example. I'd likely just buy a more expensive one.
You think that taking the holistic approach medically, rather than a strictly regulated and very well-funded medical sector, is the better way to go?
If someone wants to go for some holistic voodoo rubbish, that is up to them. What I oppose is a monopoly on healthcare that leaves no incentives to keep medicines affordable and that forces everyone to not only pay for, but use one quality of healthcare, when a free market would be able to provide them with higher and lower qualities depending on what provider you choose, be it for profit or charity.
If the non-aggression principle is about not inflicting violence onto people, is it safe to say that most people tend to violate the non-aggression principle?
It's about not initiating violence. Inflicting and initiating are completely different things. But yes, I'd say that most people have violated it at some point in their lives. No individual has managed to violate it as much as the state, however.
So, I suppose my question for anarchists is relatively straightforward. How do you account for power? Now, this being with the recognition that power is itself a force of nature, an inevitability within social groupings. understanding that within social groupings, power structures will inevitably emerge, and that in large enough groups, over long enough periods of time, those structures will themselves become something of an institution. So given the nature of power to develop within social groupings and to create everything that you seem ideologically opposed to, how do you account for power in your calls for a voluntarist utopia?
You went out of your way to try and make such a simple question as convoluted as possible, didn't you? The answer is simple. Voluntarily giving another individual power of yourself is completely your decision to make. In a free society, however, once you try and force those that do not voluntarily agree to it to follow your lead, you would likely come into conflict with the private security firms that said person has a contract with. The theory is that when there is no state in a modernized society, it will be impossible to form one because of it. The states we have today are a long-term evolution of the earliest tribal warlords in a pre-modernized society, and unless technology regresses drastically somehow, it is unlikely, if not impossible, that it would happen again. Of course, even if I'm wrong, your argument is that we'd end up back where we are, and that is not an argument not to try and achieve a free society.
What would happen to people who simply cannot work?
I'm assuming you're asking how they would survive. The answer to that is that they could rely upon the support of family, friends, charities, and even companies that need a good PR boost. Of course, without a minimum wage to price millions out of the market and a welfare state incentivizing them to stay out of it, there would likely be a lot less people who couldn't or wouldn't work.
Okay, serious question this time. How would an ANCAP system deal with water reclamation and sewage and stuff like that?
Do you mean to say that none of your previous questions were serious? Regardless, I have already answered this. The fact that you are asking the question implies that there is a demand for these things. You would hire a company to fit piping to your property, if for some reason it was not already there. There is a demand for those services, and therefore an incentive for people to provide them.